Brett McKay here, and welcome to another edition of the Art of Manliness podcast. So yeah, we've been on hiatus with the podcast for almost a year. I stopped doing it because we just got too busy with other projects and other things. But I've had a lot of people email me, tweet me, Facebook me asking, hey, when are you going to bring the podcast back? So we're doing it now. And I'm really excited about our guest that we have on today. His name is Dr. Alex Lickerman. He is a physician, a practicing physician, but he's also the author of a book that just came out last November. It's called The Undefeated Mind on the Science of Constructing an Indestructible Self. It's all about building your resilience, something we've talked about on the site before. And he goes into depth, brings in a lot of scientific studies that talk about how you can become more resilient, how you can strengthen your mental fortitude to handle whatever challenges that come your way. Well, Alex, welcome to the show. We appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to talk to us.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, Undefeated Mind, that's what the title of your book is called. How would you describe a person with an undefeated mind, and why is it so important that we try to develop this undefeated mind that you talk about?
So I think about an undefeated mind as basically a mind that is resilient. And by resilient, I mean two things. And it's sort of two sides of one coin. The first side is that when bad things happen, when adversity strikes, when tragedy lands on you, that you are able to not just survive it, but actually thrive in the face of it. So that may mean you go through it maintaining, your poise and your confidence, or it may mean you go through it and you're horribly discouraged and even depressed and anxious, but that at the end of it, you come out of it sort of not just back to where you were, but even stronger in some way. The other side of that coin, though, is that when you are striving to achieve something, you have a goal that you don't know if you can do it, that when the obstacles arise, that invariably arise whenever people try to achieve something great, when those arise, that even if you become discouraged, that doesn't stop you, that you continue on no matter what, that you don't give up when everything is telling you to give up and you feel like you need to give up or that it's hopeless, but you go on and then even if you don't achieve your goal, the reason you don't achieve it isn't because you quit, but just because it didn't work out.
So resilience and hardihood is how you describe someone with the undefeated mind.
Yeah, that's basically it. Personality, hardiness.
Yeah.
Yes. So
what experiences in your life led you to discovering the principles and practices that you talk about in your book? I found that very fascinating. You talk about some of your experience. What were some of those principles or some of those experiences that led to the book?
Yeah. So as I talk about in the book, I'm a Buddhist, and I started practicing Buddhism my first year of medical school. And frankly, up until that point, I hadn't really encountered any obstacles or tragedy in my life out of the ordinary. And then the woman who introduced me to Buddhism in my first year of medical school was a woman I then began dating. She was the first great love of my life, and when we broke up, I was just absolutely devastated. I was in retrospect now, absolutely clinically depressed. But since it was only my first year of medical school, I hadn't yet learned to diagnose that, so I didn't know I was depressed. And I was just completely shattered by it. And the practice of Buddhism involves chanting. It's a little bit foreign to many of those of us raised in the West, but it's sort of a form of meditation. And it was actually while doing that and chanting about the fact that I was just suffering far out of proportion to what I thought I should be, just because I had broken up with my girlfriend, that I had a great insight, an epiphany, that the reason I was suffering really had nothing to do with the fact that she and I had broken up, but what I believed that meant. And what I believed that meant, I was surprised to discover at that moment, was that I could never be happy, that without this woman to love me, my chance at happiness was gone. And I was stunned to discover this. And from that insight, I realized that the key to being happy, how can we be happy when so many terrible things happen to us? There's no way any of us get to live a life without having trauma and tragedy happen in our lives. It just doesn't happen. You live long enough, something's going to happen. So how can we be happy when those things happen? And the answer is we have to become so strong that no matter what happens to us, we feel we have some power, some ability to overcome whatever it is that's happened. Even if it's not overcome it in a way we want to overcome it, but still in some way achieve some kind of victory so that we can say we're done with this. We got through it, we overcame it, and we're moving on and maintain our ability to be happy. It really, the bottom line is it comes down to happiness is strength.
Yeah. And what I found fascinating was your practice of Buddhism. And you practice a particular kind of Buddhism that I never heard of. What's it called again?
It's called Nichiren Buddhism.
Okay.
And it's the practice is chanting a phrase, which is Nam-myoho Renge-kyo. Mm-hmm. And the idea, the Buddhists will tell you that the reason chanting Nam-myoho Renge-kyo has the power it does is because you're tapping into a mystic life principle. I don't actually believe that, I have to say. But I have still found that chanting that phrase over and over again, it's not like meditation where you are trying to focus on the moment and clear your mind of thoughts. It's actually, in a sense, it's a war cry. It is you are making determinations when you are chanting that you're going to solve your problems. Because a lot of times problems occur to us or happen in our lives, and we think we know how to solve them, and we try those things and they don't work, and then we try something else and it doesn't work. And when we exhaust those possibilities, typically what we do is go back and start trying the thing we tried the first time, even though it didn't work the first time because we're out of ideas. What I've learned through the practice of Buddhism is that there often are answers buried within me somewhere that either haven't occurred to me or they have, but I haven't truly opened my mind to the possibility of trying to employ some of those answers because they're either too fearful, I'm too fearful, or they seem to risk too much. What I have learned is that when I chant with a focused determination to overcome a particular problem, answers will often come to me and just sort of pop up, just the way thoughts do, that are surprising, that are not things I would have thought of on my own, but that end up often being the very things I need to do, and sometimes things I don't want to do, but if I can only muster the courage to do them, they end up being the things that enable me to solve the problem.
What I found fascinating was the insights you gained from Buddhism, an ancient philosophy. What I found fascinating throughout the book, you show how cognitive science is actually confirming the insights that these ancient philosophers had thousands of years ago.
That's what actually sparked my interest in writing the book, was that in studying Buddhism for all these years I've done, and being a physician and taking care of patients, I'm very much evidence-based. I need something proven to me to really believe it. And I started looking into a lot of research that ended up sort of supporting a lot of these 2,500-year-old ideas. And, we finally applied modern scientific methods to asking these questions, and the answers end up being what the Buddhism has been talking about all along. So it's kind of a neat synergy. Yeah.
So going back to what you talked about, your experience with breaking up with the first love of your life, and you said that thing that really, I guess the epiphany you had was your change of perception, right? You had this perception change, and it seems like that was a main thread throughout your book. That's a main principle. What I found interesting, I'm not very familiar with Buddhism, but one philosophy that I am familiar with is Stoicism. Of the ancient Romans, Seneca and Marcus Aurelius. And that's something they talk about too, that the pain that we experience in life often isn't, caused by a tragedy. It's our perception of that tragedy. And that's kind of a hard concept for us moderns to swallow, this idea that our perception is what causes us pain.
It is, but Buddhism and Stoicism are very similar that way. The idea is that it really isn't what happens to us, it's how we think about what happens to us that affects the way we feel about it. And this is not too hard a concept really to grasp if you pause for a few minutes and examine just your own reactions to things, in your own life. When something bad happens or something difficult arises in your path, when you're trying to reach a goal, if you feel that you can manage it. It may be uncomfortable and it may, be depressing to imagine, but you're not defeated by it if you feel confident to be able to solve that problem, if you're thinking about it in such a way that you can solve the problem. On the other hand, if something happens where you think, I don't know what to do, the next thought that most of us have, the automatic thought is, therefore, there is nothing that we can do. And therefore, that's when depression can set in. And so it really is our thoughts about things that govern our emotional responses. It's our emotional responses that matter. Are we suffering over this or are we not? And there's this thing, this really is reflected in modern psychology and cognitive neuroscience. There's this notion of the self-explanatory style that we all bring to our lives. So when things happen, we typically explain them to ourselves. Why did I fail that test? Or why did that girl turn me down for a date? And we come up with our explanations that we don't notice this, but we quickly settle on them as true. Without often any evidence whatsoever, our first thought often is what we decide. This is the reason. The girl turned me down because I'm not good looking enough, or because she's snobby, or I failed that test because I'm just not a good test taker. What we don't realize is that these ideas are just that. They're just ideas. They may be right, but more often than not, they're wrong. And yet we completely believe them without any question the moment we think them most of the time. And that governs not only how we think about what happened, and therefore how we feel about what happened, but also what we're going to do. So if a test taker, someone fails a test, and they say, I'm just not a good test taker. I failed that test because I stink at taking tests. They're far more likely to not study for a makeup test and fail it again. But if instead they tell themselves when they fail a test, I failed that test because I just didn't study hard enough. I got to study harder. Well, then they're much more likely to study harder the next time, and therefore more likely to pass the test. So it's not even just how you feel about what happens to you that is determined by your perception, but what you do about it and what you're able to do about it.
Yeah. So do you think, as I read this book, I started thinking about, I have ancestors, right, that crossed the plains in covered wagons, and you read journal entries that they faced so much adversity. Children died, and yet despite that, they were able to continue. They were able to thrive. And I look at my life, and I think I couldn't do that. I mean, I can't believe what they were able to do. Do you think modern society in some ways has made us less resilient in some ways?
No, I don't. I think that your estimation of what you're able to handle is wrong. You can handle far more than you think you can. It's interesting because they've done studies on people's expectations for how they will be affected by trauma in the future, and reliably people far overestimate how devastated they will be by imagined traumas. And don't actually predict how well they'll be happy in the future either. So you look back at your ancestors who went through some of those trials, and you say to yourself, I could never have done this. But in fact, were you confronted with it, the answer might be very different. And you don't really know how strong you are, how resilient you are, until you are facing a trial that forces you to be resilient. In a sense, strength only appears when you are forced to lift a heavy weight. That's when you know how strong you are. So I suspect that in general, the population alive now, modern people, are actually as resilient as our ancestors. We just haven't had to face the same things, for which we're all very grateful. But if we were to, I think we would surprise ourselves. Yeah.
So I guess the takeaway there is whenever you do face a really, life-changing adversity or life-changing challenge, I guess the takeaway is realize you're going to be able to get through it, that you're stronger than you think you are.
Absolutely right. And interestingly, when you look at studies of people who've actually gone through horrible things that most people don't go through, and you look and see over time how they do, most of the time, most people not only get through those things, they come right back to their previous level of happiness, whatever that was, eventually. But what's interesting is when you tell people that and you say, there really are great studies that show, as awful as it seems today, you will eventually be happy again. Knowing that, even when people believe it, does not by itself make going through that thing easier. Mm-hmm. It's not enough just to know it, but sometimes it is. Sometimes people will have that thought and they think, I will be happy again, and when they believe it, that can sort of get them through this. But again, that's why I wrote the book, to sort of hand people techniques they can do to sort of maintain their confidence and their resilience when they're going through those really difficult times.
Definitely. So another one of my favorite concepts in your book is this idea of turning poison into medicine. And can you explain what you mean by this and maybe give an example of turning poison into medicine?
Sure. So it's a Buddhist idea, and the notion is that it seems to be inherent within the human mind and the human heart that when tragedy or trauma, adversity strikes, and we are so quick to judge the final value of those events as all bad, that in fact we have within us the capability of transforming events that appear to be all bad at once into something that creates value for us. Now, this does not mean that you can reverse necessarily the bad thing that's happened to you. If your son dies, some horrible thing, it doesn't mean that you're going to bring that son back to life by any means. Nor does it mean necessarily you're going to be as happy as you were, or that you're going to ever stop hurting or missing, your son. But what it means is that there is nothing that can happen to you, no matter how awful you can imagine it, from which you cannot create value, some value. And in fact, in that really the most extreme circumstance you talk about, parents losing children, studies have actually shown that parents actually do get surprising benefits from that, as almost kind of perverse that sounds. That they become closer to their surviving children, that they become more courageous in general. I'm not for a minute suggesting that those benefits make up for such a loss, but a lot of times in more mundane, more common losses and traumas that we may suffer, you actually can come out actually ahead. You just can't predict the future. So, the example that I would give, which I think I write about in the book as well, is when I was a second-year medical student, right after my girlfriend's first love we talked about, and I broke up, I became so depressed I couldn't concentrate, I couldn't study, and I failed part one of the national board exam. And I thought my life was over. I thought, if you don't pass part one, you can't graduate medical school. I was already in debt, and I thought, I'm not going to become a doctor. I don't know what to do because I didn't have time to study for it. You're supposed to launch into the third year, which is where you do all your work with patients, a year that is renowned for swallowing days at a time of a person's time. So, I thought this is the worst possible thing that could have happened to me. But so rather than give up, I just decided, okay, so my choice is to drop out of medical school, or I'm going to find some way to study this test, take it again, and pass it. And I decided that's what I was going to try to do. I ultimately did it, by completely eliminating any free time, any social time whatsoever for a year, and got through it and scored actually above the mean, which I had never done in any test prior to medical in medical school. And then, so I thought, okay, I got through that. I graduated, got a great residency, and ended up as a teaching attending at the University of Chicago. And then one day, a student had come to see me who had failed her third-year internal medicine clerkship, her rotation up on the wards. Again, you can imagine, just devastated. And I found myself telling her the story of how I had almost completely flunked out of medical school, but I persevered and was able to succeed and eventually pass the test. And I told her, I realized that being forced to go back and study all that material made me a better doctor, that as a result of having to learn that material again, I learned it and could sort of manipulate it and think about medicine and science in a way that I was looking around and seeing my peers really weren't doing. And in many instances, it was leading me to make diagnoses I really didn't think I otherwise would have made. But then the real benefit, the real medicine of that coincidence experience was then suddenly I had this story to tell her. And in telling her, I could see, I literally was watching her, hearing my story, and her face changing, thinking, I know what she was thinking. She was thinking, if he could do it, then I could do it. And I think, even if we can't find some benefit in horrible tragedy or trauma that's happened to us, and we don't, actually turn it into some real victory that we feel in some way we won, we can always use those experiences to encourage other people, and in that way create a value that can be surprising to us and really actually enable us to one day say, I'm almost glad that happened to me because I've been able to encourage so many people with that story. And I have with that story.
That's fantastic. So what do you think is one of the more counterintuitive principles or practices that you talk about in the book that if someone applied, they would become more resilient, more hardy. But if you told them that, hey, you need to do this, they would think, nah, that wouldn't work, and I'm not going to do that. Are there any counterintuitive principles or practices like that?
So one of them that I consider counterintuitive, at least it was to me when I sort of stumbled across it, is the notion of accepting pain. People who, say, lift weights really hard, they get this already. They understand that pain is gain. But when you apply that sort of to your life, it becomes a little less obvious how that can be beneficial. But it basically works like this. So it turns out that a lot of suffering that people experience in life is not as a result of bad things happening to them, but it's as a result of them trying to run away from the bad feelings that bad things happening causes. So people turn to drugs and alcohol because they're anxious about things and end up destroying their lives when, really just trying to avoid the feeling of anxiety. Or men will try to sabotage relationships with women prevent the women from breaking up with them because they have such a fear of rejection. And so they ruin perfectly healthy and happy relationships because of their fear. They're trying to avoid something that feels bad. And so, the idea that there is legitimate pain for us to feel, and that when we feel it, we should allow ourselves to feel it, can be very powerful, because we all have goals in life, and it is often our own uncomfortable feelings that prevent us from achieving them. So, for example, if a man wants to ask a woman out, or maybe go to parties to meet women, but has horrible social anxiety, just really has a hard time doing that, it's actually the feeling anxiety that they want to avoid, and so they learn to avoid it by avoiding the circumstances that trigger it, meaning, asking women out and going to parties. On the other hand, they have this goal of wanting to meet somebody. So what do? Well, there's this new therapy called acceptance and commitment therapy that basically talks about this notion of acceptance, which is that you say to yourself, my goal is not to stop feeling anxiety. I'm going to allow myself to feel anxiety, and I'm going to actually take the action that's going to get me towards my goal, even if it makes me feel anxious. I'm going to accept I'm going to feel anxious. Just that mental 180 where you stop reflexively trying to avoid those painful feelings and allow yourself to feel them is incredibly empowering and adds to resilience. And interestingly, and paradoxically, what studies have shown is that when people actually approach, say, anxiety that way, it actually reduces anxiety, which importantly is not the goal. It's not the goal. The goal is to actually become more comfortable feeling it and not allowing it to stop you from doing what you need to do to accomplish the goals that you have. And so I've actually, done this work, introduced this principle to many patients of mine who have told me anecdotally it really does work. When you suddenly transform yourself from someone who does everything they can to avoid whatever pain you're feeling, it can be even physical pain, to someone who sort of bucks up and says, yeah, I can withstand this. It's really awful. It's really uncomfortable, but I'm just going to suck it up. Suddenly you become really powerful, and the things you are able to do will surprise you.
Seems like, by taking away the uncertainty of pain, you're no longer uncertain that there will be pain, that anxiety clears up.
Yes. I mean, you accept the fact, and you actually, in a sense, almost embrace it, the way a weightlifter embraces the pain of lifting weights, because he understands it's that pain that represents hard work and therefore growth. And so the experience of feeling even physical pain, when you understand that it does not mean harm, that it's okay to feel it, it's much less emotionally aversive. It's interesting. They've actually studied when people experience pain that is caused intentionally by someone, it actually hurts more than when pain is caused by someone accidentally. The way we think about it has a profound effect on our subjective experience of it.
That's really interesting. Well, here's the last question. As I read this book, I kind of perceived that developing an undefeated mind is a lifelong process. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. So my question is, how do you maintain the motivation to develop an undefeated mind or a more resilient personality when you face setbacks in the process? Because I've had this challenge. I'm trying to work on becoming more hardy and more resilient, and I'll do good for a few weeks, and then I'll have something happens where I break down, and I kind of have this breakdown in my resilience. I begin this like cycle where I get discouraged about my inability to be resilient, and I get sort of this horrible cycle where I just sort of ruminate about things. What's your advice on someone who wants to develop a more resilient attitude, a more undefeated mind? How do they maintain that motivation to do that?
So if I use what you just said as an example, you would think about it like a dieter. Somebody's trying to lose weight. So what dooms people who are trying to lose weight is not when they cheat on one day and think, they've blown it. It turns out that caloric intake on a daily basis does not correlate to long-term weight gain or weight loss, which means if one day out of the week you eat terribly, but then immediately go back to following your diet, it's as if that one day didn't happen. What dooms people who are dieting is when that one day happens, when they give in to temptation and they blow their diet, then they say to themselves, well, I've blown it. And they call themselves all types of names, and then they say, well, I might as well give up because I've blown it already. It's too late. And then it is the subsequent days that actually ruin them. So if, for example, when you're trying to become a resilient person, you're doing really well, and then something happens, you get knocked off the horse, and then you say, I blew it again, and I can't do this. First thing is you don't judge yourself, because being resilient does not mean you don't get knocked off your horse. It means you get back up on it. And so it's really hard to practice the things I talk about in the book to develop yourself into a more resilient person when you're not facing something that makes you need to be resilient. And of course, if you're not facing that at the moment, it's okay. You don't need to sort of practice these things other than to sort of be prepared, so when something does happen, you can reflexively go to them. But I view, like, when things hit you as an opportunity for you to train yourself to be more resilient. It's sort of like, when you lift weights, you're not going to feel your strength, experience your strength, or actually increase your strength unless you're actually lifting them. There's got to be some obstacle for you to push against. So in fact, it's those very moments when you feel most discouraged that you have the greatest opportunity to actually become resilient. But even I, I've been this Buddhist for 20 plus years, and I wrote this book. When bad things happen, often my first reflexive response is, oh no, and what am I going to do? And I can't survive this. And then you start to have to reflexively get in the habit of examining your negative self-talk and recognize that this is just another voice in your head, and remind yourself, I do have the tools to become resilient. I just have to grab a hold of them and pick them up. Sometimes that takes longer. You don't do it right away. Sometimes it takes a week, sometimes longer. But at some point, you do have to say to yourself, okay, I have to own the situation. I have to figure out what I can do and take care of myself and buck up my inner self so that I can actually manage the situation. So once you suddenly start having those thoughts, and then you remember, oh yeah, there are these things I can do. I've learned to do that actually will lead me to success and help to buoy my life condition while I'm going through this. So it is like anything else. It takes continual practice, which means sometimes you'll be better at it, and sometimes not as good. Be very gentle with yourself. If you don't meet your expectations today, that's fine. That's okay. As long as you try again tomorrow, you are being resilient.
Very good. Well, that's actually really helpful for me. Well, Alex, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. The book is The Undefeated Mind on the Science of Constructing an Indestructible Self, and you can find that on Amazon. Alex, thanks again for being with us.
Oh, thanks so much. I really enjoyed talking.
Well, that wraps up another edition of the Art of Manliness podcast. For more manly tips and advice, make sure to check out the Art of Manliness podcast at artofmanliness.com. And until next time, stay manly.